This meeting to order.
Je déclare
11 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. The committee is meeting on its study of impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the government's ability to deliver information in both official languages. Malheureusement, en raison des
Unfortunately, due to the deferred votes at the House of Commons, we only have one group of witnesses with us this afternoon. I would like for the consent of members to extend the meeting until 5:50 because the technical team is available till then. Is there any objection to that? Any objection? 5:55, would 5:50 work for everyone? Very well, thank you very much. Madam Clerk, any people replacing other members or any members in the room? There are no people replacing members and there are no members in the room today. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, to make sure that everything runs smoothly, I'd like to share a few rules with you. For those of you that are taking part in the meeting remotely, so the members and witnesses can speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available during the meeting. At the bottom of your screen, you may choose to speak or to pick up the English or French channels.
Phone icon to activate your own mic. When you are done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. And should members need to request the floor outside of the designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. Si un député souhaite
If a member wants to speak as to a point of order on another member's point of order, you have to use your hand-raising function to indicate to the chair that he or she wants to speak, and there will be a list drawn up. Your name will be added to the list. To raise your hand, click on Participant at the bottom of the screen, and when the list appears, you will see next to your name the button Raise Your Hand that you can then click on. When you do speak, express yourselves clearly and slowly, please. Unless you're in an exceptional circumstances, all remote participants must use a boom mic and headsets. Note any kind of technical problem, and please note that we may have to suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes, given that we have to guarantee the full participation of all members. Now, with respect to the people who will be speaking in the list, the clerk and myself will do our very utmost to maintain the list of speakers for all members participating either in person or remotely. I would now like to welcome all members to the committee and all witnesses. Thank you for having sent us your speeches as well. We appreciate that. I would urge you to also send your briefs directly to the clerk for this important study. You will have 7.5 minutes each for your speeches, and in order to manage time, I will indicate to you when you have 1 minute left, and when you get this card up, it means your time is up. And that will be the tough job that I am responsible for. So, without any further ado, we are welcoming here today the Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario. We have Mr. Carole Jolin and Mr. Peter Omnilock. The Fédération des Francophones de la Colombie-Britannique, Ms. Padmini Chandan Singh, Chair of the Board.
Network, we have Marlène Jennings, President, and Sylvia Martel-Laforge, Directrice Générale. Et pour la Société de l'Acadie.
And for the Société de l'Acadie du Nouveau-Brunswick, we are welcoming Mr. Alexandre Cédric Doucet, who is the President, and Alice Chesson, who is Director General. So, without any further ado, let us start with the Assemblée de la Francophonie de l'Ontario. You have 7.5 minutes to start, to make your presentation. I believe Mr. Jolin wanted to, or Ms. Jolin wanted to start. Mr. Jolin. Yes. Good afternoon, good day to all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking you for welcoming me to speak to you as to the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the government's ability to provide information in both official languages. As you know, 2020 has been very eventful because of the COVID-19 crisis. First, we want to acknowledge the Government of Canada's efforts to maintain continuous and efficient communications with our network since the onset of the pandemic. Throughout the crisis, we have worked to identify the problems faced by the Franco-Ontarian community. Alone or in partnership with other organizations, the AFU has conducted 3 surveys on the situations that Francophone or Franco-Ontarian organizations are facing during the pandemic. We have also been monitoring the French language services provided by both the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario. As a result of this work, today we submit to you in both official languages a report containing our observations during the crisis, as well as 9 recommendations. This report discusses federal services only. We are currently preparing a similar report on provincial services in Ontario. Regarding federal services, our observations concern the following areas: the travelers returning to Canada, government press briefings, labeling of consumer products, funding levels for Franco-Ontarian organizations, translation, and social media presence. Before I briefly discuss each of these points individually, I would like to state the general conclusion, namely that the pandemic has heightened the urgency of modernizing the Official Languages Act. In fact, the first recommendation in our report invites the government to modernize the Act, and in so doing to take the AFU's recommendations into account. Both the AFU and the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages have noted that designated airports, as well as the Public Health Agency of Canada, have not fulfilled their language obligations when serving travelers returning to Canada. Airports designated to provide bilingual services failed to serve their customers in both official languages, and the Public Health Agency of Canada did not provide active offer and truly equal service in its telephone monitoring of travelers in self-isolation. Our report also notes that the AFU supports Recommendation 2 contained in the report of the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages on government services in times of crisis, which asks the Treasury Board to implement a crisis preparedness strategy, including communications plans and procedures for every federal institution. In our monitoring of government services, we have also observed that the Government of Canada's press conferences, press briefings, especially in the early days of the pandemic, were largely limited to English, while the Chief Public Health Officer's press briefings were totally in English. In the context of a pandemic, Francophones rely on the government's press briefings to stay informed about the restrictions and the best practices to follow. Those breaches could be catastrophic and a life and death situation. To ensure the equality of communications in both languages, we recommend that the Government of Canada designate the position of Chief Public Health Officer of Canada as bilingual. Further, regarding press briefings, we've also noticed that Radio-Canada was not living up to its mandate because the Government of Ontario's press briefings were rarely provided with simultaneous translation. Some Franco-Ontarians have told me that they are relying on Quebec government press briefings or English CBC channels to obtain information on COVID-19. Radio-Canada has rebuffed our recommendations concerning its television broadcasts, despite the fact that the service we demanded is part of the corporation's mandate. Our report, therefore, reiterates 2 recommendations drawn from our brief to the CRTC regarding the renewal of the CBC's broadcasting license. During the pandemic, we also observed that bilingual labeling standards were not being met. It's easy for the government to avoid its language obligations in this area, as Health Canada demonstrated on March 19th and April 27th. With its directives to rescind bilingual labeling rules for certain products used to lower health risks, such as disinfectants and antiseptics. It is therefore vital that the government set out its labeling requirements within the Official Languages Act. Flouting language rights is too easy when all you have to do is to suspend part of a regulation. The last in-depth update of the Official Languages Act goes back to pre-digital times. This means that the Act is silent, of course, on concerns relating to social media. We were taken aback when Professor Stéphanie Chouinard stated on November 26 that 80% of the Government of Canada's social media communications during the pandemic were in English. This is far from true equality of service. The Government of Canada should seize the opportunity that modernizing the Official Languages Act would provide to ensure true equality of French and English in social media communications. There are also problems in the area of translation. The Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages has
de communication ou prestation de service.
There was some sound problems there for the interpreter. The Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages has received a number of complaints regarding the lack of communications or services in both official languages as well as language of work rights. We wish to express our support for the Commissioner's first recommendation on this issue, which includes creating an express translation service, among other measures. I will conclude with this final observation about problems that predate the pandemic but have greatly impacted our organizations in recent months. Franco-Ontarian organizations are chronically underfunded compared to similar organizations across the country, and this has greatly weakened our network during the pandemic. Ontario is home to 55% of Canada's Francophone population and 1/3 of Francophone non-profit organizations outside of Quebec. Yet Ontario's share of the federal funding provided to Francophone community organizations outside of Quebec is only 23%. The pandemic has amplified the impact of this underfunding. Our studies show that approximately 10% of our Franco-Ontarian organizations are confronting a critical situation that could force them to close down in the near future. Like many others, our network has been shaken and weakened by COVID-19. However, we were already weakened by years of underfunding, and that has become all the more obvious during the pandemic. It's important that the federal government move to correct immediately the inequality of funding between provinces without penalizing other provinces' communities in any way. I thank you, members of the committee, for your attention and consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is up to me to thank you, Mr. Jolann. Thank you. Now, I'd like to hand over the floor to the Fédération francophone de la Colombie-Britannique. We have the chair of the board, Ms. Chandan Singh. You have the floor. Please turn on your mic. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Standing Committees on Official Languages, good day. Former members of the committee who came to meet us in Vancouver and whom I'd like to take this opportunity to say hello to know who I am, but I would like to introduce myself to the new members of the committee. My name is Padmini Chandan Singh. I'm the chair of the board of directors of the Fédération des francophones de la Colombie-Britannique. I'd like to thank you for inviting us to share with you some testimony as to what's been happening in our province. The work of Canadian Heritage. Last March, as soon as the containment measures, lockdown measures had been taken and that the consequences of these measures were noted, Minister Joly and officials from the Department of Canadian Heritage acted quickly to explain that the funding would not be interrupted and that events could be postponed to later dates without risk of penalty. This allowed our member organizations to breathe momentarily. That said, the closure of childcare centers or of other services that allowed our associations to release additional funds to complement the subsidies on a sustainable basis weakened our members. Now, communications from the federal government. On the health front, in BC, we have been very quickly in a situation of having our world turned upside down. The level of government, the order of government that has neither legislation nor language obligations, in this case, the government of BC, communicated more information in French than the federal government itself, whereas the federal government is, as we know, subject to the Official Languages Act. However, we have no illusions about this upturn, which has more to do with the fact that our Minister of Health is also our Minister of Francophone Affairs, and we would like to commend her for the work and determination, commend them for the work and determination in the department led by Adrian Dix in both of these capacities. There is no indication that the rest of the provincial government and the administrative machinery are less inclined to significantly and permanently improve the use of French in their communications. The lack of information from the federal government has had several effects on Francophone organizations and citizens, especially those in precarious situations. It was difficult to access information and services as soon as they were not directly related to health. In terms of information on federal programs, this information was available in French.
Some people were able to obtain everything they needed, but others were told that services were not available in French. We had been alerted by users of Service Canada that services in French in Vancouver Centre, which is a designated bilingual zone, were not offered anymore. After looking into this and having contacted the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, who supported us, we learned that the officials had not felt that it was important to reopen French services. We therefore wrote to Minister Qualtrough with Madame Joly and Mr. Duclos and CC to inform them of the situation and request a reopening of services in French, especially given the importance of Service Canada for providing the CERB benefits and employment insurance benefits. As of today, our letter remains unanswered. We are continuing to hear contradictory information about the availability of services in French. We know through one of our members that approximately 40% of women who are in lockdown with a violent spouse and who participated in a survey had not turned to assistance services because they didn't know that there was any help available. Francophone immigrants seem to have had more difficulties than the rest of the population. We are informed that people would go to the integration system for African immigrants in order to obtain assistance to be able to fill out their application for employment insurance because they had not been able to obtain any assistance in French from Service Canada. Several Francophone African families who are low-income in regular times ended up without jobs during COVID. Schools had closed and courses were now online, but the children of these families were not able to continue their studies because they either didn't have computers and or didn't have sufficient internet connections to be able to continue to study. Francophone schools could not afford to provide a computer to every student or high-speed internet for families. Francophone immigrant families generally use interpretation services when they go to the doctor. Because of lockdown, medical consultations took place online and interpretation became difficult. Several Francophones, therefore, were not able to consult their doctor because of this. At the community level, there was a lot of confusion about who was doing what, and this led to absurd situations where provincial civil servants and employees of organizations on the ground refused to get involved with Francophones, explaining that the federal government was supporting their needs. These shortcomings, which were specifically related to the pandemic and its consequences, are on top of the other more common situations in BC. The lack of bilingual communication and lack of bilingual people in airports, the lack of bilingual agents at safety and border crossings. The minimum number of bilingual employees means that the service is interrupted as soon as an employee is not at work. And there is generally either incomprehension or animosity on the part of federal civil servants when it comes to language obligations. The pandemic has led to a particularly difficult situation for Francophone immigrants whose immigration status is in transition. At the Federation alone, we had to lay off 2 employees who had come to the end of their TVP visa. And this was their temporary work permit, and they were still waiting to find out their Francophone mobility or permanent resident status. Our collaborator was supposed to get permanent residency on June 15th, but it only came in at the end of September. During these long months, it was very difficult to obtain information that was up-to-date and relevant and in French, and it was even more difficult to reach any officers or agents. Beyond these 2 particular cases, we heard a lot of stories about people who would lose their jobs because they had lost their status. And because of the high cost of living in the Vancouver urban region, they had to leave the country. The pool of Francophone candidates in our province is not very large, so it's essential for organizations to be able to count on the skills of people who are already on the job without risking losing them because of delays in the processing of their immigration files. In conclusion, while the Minister of Canadian Heritage intervened very quickly to calm the concerns of the community and support them, communication and assistance from other government departments at the federal level were chaotic and sporadic. The Federation shares the point of view of the FCFA that language management in the pandemic has proven once again that if Francophones don't want to be second-class citizens, we have to modernize the Official Languages Act and give it more teeth. If not, we will continue to be confronted with these inconsistent situations which are potentially humiliating and definitely dangerous to health and public safety. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation.
Community Group Network, and maybe Mrs. Jennings, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Marlene Jennings, and I am the newly elected president of the QCGN. I am here with our Director General, Sylvia Martin-Laforge. For those new to the committee, the Quebec Community Groups Network, QCGN, is a not-for-profit organization linking many organizations and stakeholders across Quebec. We identify, explore, and address strategic issues affecting the development and vitality of the English-speaking community of Quebec. On March 16th, Quebec imposed a first lockdown as the pandemic was spreading across the province. As time passed and the situation worsened, Quebecers were being reassured by daily briefings from the Prime Minister and the Premier. We would like to especially applaud Premier Legault's example of delivering messages and responding to media questions in English during each of his press briefings. The Commissioner for Official Languages conducted a survey about official languages and emergency situations. The results of his questionnaire noted that 89% of English-speaking Quebecers think it important to hear and see their political leaders speak in their preferred official language during emergency situations. So the decision by the leadership of both levels of government to provide news and reassurances in both official languages was very helpful. Sylvia?
Mrs. Martin-Laforge, you can open your mic.
Sorry, I've got it. We commend the federal bureaucracy for their work dealing with the many organizations in our network who suddenly had to change deliverables and had many questions about funding and their futures. Federal civil servants bent over backwards to provide support and information to our community sector, allowing us to continue operations and provide sorely needed direct services to English-speaking Quebecers. Early in the pandemic, the QCGN reached out to members and community stakeholders to identify immediate needs and learn how best to support our community during this unprecedented public health emergency. We heard loud and clear that it was essential to members of our linguistic minority community that they have access to quality information in their language.
Understandably, not everything went well. The Commissioner's questionnaire notes that 38% of English-speaking Quebecers had difficulty obtaining public health information or safety information from federal institutions in the language of their choice during the pandemic. This is higher than the 25% of Francophones outside Quebec who reported on the same issue. We think this was because while the federal and provincial governments were working together at the highest levels, their individual program announcements and rollouts were being done separately. And honestly, you know as well as we do that most Canadians, most Quebecers don't understand the complexity surrounding the distribution of federal and provincial areas of responsibility. Sylvia.
The pandemic also exposed the continued need for multiple channel message distribution. The internet is a great tool, but the digital divide is real. High-speed internet is not universally available and is rare outside of urban centers. And even where it is available, it is not economically feasible or is beyond the technical ability of the most vulnerable. Community sector organizations hand-delivered COVID-related material to the technologically isolated. They literally drove to people's homes to deliver pamphlets. This highlights again the essential service provided by community newspapers, which reach people. The internet does not. All levels of government must include community newspapers in their emergency response communication plans. And of course, these newspapers require ongoing support to protect the valuable service they provide.
During the week of March 30th, a French version of a 24-page printed COVID self-guide began to arrive in Quebec mailboxes. On page 2 of this document, there was a message stating that an English copy of the document could be accessed at a specific website. The only problem was that the message was in French. Over the next several weeks, the availability of this English online guide was communicated online. Although we are a highly bilingual community, seniors and other vulnerable English-speaking Quebecers are the least likely to be able to speak French or even have access or the ability to access internet. Cherchez Waldo. Through the QCGN's advocacy efforts, the government of Quebec did mail out 800,000 English versions of this guide to Quebec taxpayers who had previously requested to receive their Revenu Québec documents in English. These guides began arriving in English households in June. Inserts of the guides were also inserted in major English newspapers, along with ads explaining how to access online information. But by the time this was happening, we were coming off the first peak of COVID. So for many, this information was too late. Critical information during a public health emergency must be distributed through multiple channels in as many languages, including and especially in a widely used language like in English, as possible at the beginning of an emergency to ensure the widest possible penetration across the population. This is especially true during a pandemic. You know as well as we do, viruses aren't interested in the language of their victims. There is a public interest in making sure everyone receives timely information. And when issues related to health and safety are at risk, the Charter of the French language does not restrict public communications in a language other than French. The government of Quebec is obligated to communicate in both languages when the health and safety of Quebecers is in peril. Not doing so threatens the health and welfare of Quebecers, and in terms of the pandemic, exacerbates the virus spreading. The interpretation and dissemination of safety information during a national emergency like the pandemic must be an area of cooperation between the federal and provincial governments. There must be common messaging, and this messaging...
Thank you. Excuse
me.
Thank you. We have to stop right here. I'm so sorry. So right now, let's go. Nous allons écouter la Société de l'Acadie du Nouveau-Brunswick. C'est peut-être Monsieur.
I think Mr. Cédric Doucet will be speaking next. I would ask you to start. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Mr. Chairman, my name is Alexandre Cédric Doucet. I am the president of the Société de l'Acadie du Nouveau-Brunswick, the organization that represents the Acadian and Francophones of the province of New Brunswick. I'm here today with Mr. Ali Chiasson, Chesson, Executive Director of the SINB. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to speak to you today as a representative of the 20,000 members of my organization and by extension of the approximately 235,000 Francophones living in the only officially bilingual province in the country. I thank you most sincerely for inviting the SANB to testify in the context of the modernization of the Official Languages Act in the midst of the pandemic. This is important because the last time the Act was revised in 1988, members of Parliament seem to have forgotten New Brunswick. The SANB is here to ensure that this does not happen again. I will not begin my speech today by talking about the deportation of Acadians, even though the 2003 Royal Proclamation signed by the Queen and Right of Canada and her Governor-General Adrienne Clarkson recognizes the harm done to Acadians in 1755, a tragic milestone in the building of Canada. However, it is with the weight of my nation's entire history that I would like to begin my presentation by drawing a very clear line in the sand. I'm Acadian. I am a Canadian to the extent that Canada helps me remain Acadian. That quote is not mine, but that of one of our great Acadian builders, the late Father Léger Comeau, who was once president of the Société Nationale de l'Acadie. It succinctly and precisely summarizes the SANB's perspective on the underlying nature of the special, sometimes incredible relationships that exist between the Acadian nation and the Canadian state in terms of the social contract represented by all of our official languages, laws, policies, and regulations. Dear members of the committee, I'm 26 years old. The last time the Act was revised in 1988, I wasn't even born. In preparation for this speech to you, I have read several documents published by the SANB over the years. Briefs written by eminent Acadians who worked for the SANB or who served as its presidents before me, some of whose names may be familiar to you, Mr. Michel Bastarache and Mr. Michel Doucet, both lawyers, among others. My predecessors have gone very far in the legal meanderings and the political calculations and the analyses of the cause and consequences of this or that decision, of this or that amendment to the Act, and the choice of words, even in the weight of omissions. I put myself in their shoes, and it is with a great weariness coupled with disappointment that I am seized. That's what it's all about. So much work in the last 50 years to come to such a troubling conclusion. We're still asking the same thing. The Official Languages Act lacks teeth, and Canada's elected officials have failed in their duty towards official language minority communities. As one of my predecessors said in the SANB's September 1975 brief to the Task Force on French Language Minorities, he said, had it not been for the programs developed by the federal government to ensure the recognition of French, New Brunswick would never have become bilingual. But bilingualism is not an end in and of itself. It is only a necessary evil. What must be remembered is that there are Francophone communities of various sizes in Canada, and that these communities want to continue to be what they have always been, that is, French-speaking. These communities will remain Francophone with or without Canada. If it is with Canada, it will be in what is called bilingual Canada, where the two official linguistic elements of the country will enjoy real, complete, and absolute rights. In the current context, in this era of easy words and sparse attentive actions, I cannot help but notice that these sentences still resonate 45 years later and express the Acadian people's determination to persevere in their existence and in their specificity. But I wonder, sincerely, at the rate things are going, will my future grandchildren be forced to come back here before your committee in 50 years to demand the same things? Will they finally see a modernized Official Languages Act that lives up to the aspirations of our great country? Will they even still be Canadians? Or will they have assimilated into the majority language? As Renaud Morin-Rossignol said, while all these beautiful people in Parliament, the Canadian Parliament and New Brunswick Parliament play around while not really doing anything for our group, our association will continue to fight for our group. Let me give you a very interesting example here. At the beginning of the pandemic, New Brunswick's minister responsible for professional languages none other than the Premier Blaine Higgs, whose mastery of French is limited to say the least, refused to appoint a francophone or bilingual individual to address Acadians in their language at his daily press conferences. He even demanded that a Radio-Canada journalist ask him his question in English. This was vaguely reprimanded by the New Brunswick Commissioner of Official Languages, who prefers a minimalist, even lax interpretation of government responsibilities regarding official languages. French, unfortunately, remains a language of translation, a language of accommodations. Despite all our laws and political institutions, the tragic reality is that our government was not even able to speak to us in our own language, an official language, during the worst health crisis of the last 100 years. Many Acadians, therefore, changed the channel to listen to François Legault's press briefings in order to be informed in French. The others had no choice but to practice their English. Is this the way to fight against assimilation in Canada? Is the very notion of fighting against assimilation so taboo, hidden by the shame that the Canadian state feels for its poor record in defending and promoting French? Will denial save the face of our public policies on official languages by inoculating them against the outrage of this historical act? I appeal to your courage and your responsibility as statesmen and women. The future is now taking shape. We are truly at a crossroads. It is up to you to decide which direction the great Canadian project will take. Thank you and good evening. Thank you very much, Monsieur Cédric Doucet. Thank you to all of our witnesses. It is really fascinating to hear from you. Your collaboration, your good rapport is very important. So we are going to start the question period right away, and we will start for over the next 6 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Dalton. You have the floor, Mr. Dalton.
Merci beaucoup à tous les.
Thank you to all the witnesses. Your words and your stories open our eyes to the reality of the minority official language communities, especially during this pandemic. I'd like to specifically, as a member for British Columbia, I'd like to thank Padmine for her efforts. And on behalf of your work on behalf of the Federation is much appreciated. You said a number of things. We heard you. We heard your frustration. You talked about the federal government's response as being shocking, sporadic, humiliating, dangerous, and that here in Vancouver, in the Vancouver region, it's supposed to be a bilingual region. It's all well and good to say those things, but at the end of the day, during the pandemic, we were able to see that it was just empty words. It was very difficult for Francophone immigrants in that situation. They were lost, basically. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Do you think a Modernized Official Languages Act would have helped during this pandemic? Madame Shondenseng, please answer the question. You don't have to wait for me. If the question is for you, you can just turn on your mic. Yes, I think the modernization of the Act is very important. It would be very helpful for us because ultimately in BC, the Act is not mandatory here in BC. I think if the Official Languages Act were updated, it would force the availability of all these French language services. Thank you. Can you share with us the situation you experienced with Service Canada? What exactly happened with Service Canada? Oh, actually, with their services to Francophones. When immigrants ask for services, Service Canada feels that it doesn't have to serve Canadians in French. It's unfortunate for these Francophone immigrants to Canada. You know, they've said we don't have to, or we're not under any obligation to offer these services in French. Thank you. I'll be splitting my time with Mr. Blaney. If he's ready, he can take over. Go ahead, Mr. Blaney. Yes, thank you, Mark. From BC, I do have a question for our witnesses. Were you consulted on the white paper announced by the federal government? Let's start with the order of the witnesses. Mr. Jolin, were you consulted on the white paper? No, we were not. But with the FCFA, we made public a while ago a document that set out the changes we wanted to see. Yes, we've done plenty of studies on that. The FCFA was not even consulted. Same question for Ms. Sylvia Laforge, QCGN. Were you consulted as to the white paper? I'd like Ms. Marlene Jennings to answer the question. Was the QCGM consulted, Ms. Jennings? The answer is simple, no. Now, what about New Brunswick? The Acadians, were you consulted? No. We tabled it before the Senate. Well, you're right. What you said was it requires a revolution for official languages, like what Brian Mulroney had done at the time, to give that legislation some teeth. What about BC? Ms. Chandan Singh, do you know were you consulted on the white paper? The answer is categorically no. No consultations on that. I want to thank you. I know I'm splitting my time with Mark, but basically, what you're telling us in your testimony is that the pandemic has catalyzed problems, has worsened problems that already existed. Let me dive right in with my question, Mr. Jolin. Radio-Canada, what exactly happened? You would expect that the national television service would play its role during the pandemic. You said that they basically turned a blind eye. Well, first of all, we work with the government of Ontario. The sound is not good for the interpreter here. So we asked Radio-Canada to televise the press briefings later after the fact. We wrote a letter to the president of Radio-Canada. It took over 3 months to get an answer. Surprisingly, it was just before the public consultations. So the answer was no for us. It was totally unacceptable to us. In fact, we're going to be there before the CRTC hearings, and we're going to be addressing this issue. 10 seconds? Okay, so if you could share the content of your request and the letter to Radio-Canada, I think members of the committee would appreciate knowing what exactly happened. The other aspect, and I'll close, Mr. Chair, on this, is that national languages is an issue of health and safety. QCGN were telling us these very things. Thank you, Mr. Blaney. Madame Lalonde, you have the floor for the next 6 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be splitting my time with my colleague, Mr. Arsenault. I'd really like to thank our witnesses for having agreed to join us to testify before our committee. And I would like to say that at the beginning of the pandemic, we really realized, and I think you were all referring to it on some level, how important this sharing of information by the Prime Minister on a daily basis at the beginning of the pandemic, how important it was to share information. Mr. Jolin, you referred to this. In Ontario, we have had some difficulties. This is the largest Francophonie group outside of Quebec. I was really disappointed, and I must say that even as a federal member of parliament, I received many complaints as to the shortcomings in terms of the availability of information in French.
I think it took several months before we were able to have French press briefings. And we're talking about health and safety. Really, the province was supposed to provide that information. So I'd like to congratulate Mr. Legault. I think some of you did refer to this. He did respect the English-speaking language minority in Quebec by ending his press briefings in English. I would like to ask a question specifically to Mr. Jolin. First of all, thank you for accepting our invitation. We sense that the pandemic has, how can I say this, taught us to work with different tools, to work virtually, such as we're doing this evening with today's technology. I know that not everybody can access this technology, but I would like to ask you, from your point of view, how could we use technology, today's technology, so as to be able to improve the French language service offerings federally, but also provincially? And what would your recommendations be that I support? Thank you for your question. We saw in the Commission of Official Languages report the possibility of creating an express translation team. With today's technology, there could be 3 or 4 people working together on the same document. I don't know why, given what we already know and given what's available, why shouldn't we be able to have somebody translating while somebody else is actually writing the document for the press releases, for example? The reason is because it's urgent. You want the document to be out as soon as possible. I saw a Translation Bureau of Canada presentation saying, well, today, with the technology and the quality of the tools we have that allow for translation, we don't necessarily need translators. We need people who are just going to reread. So this is also something to take into consideration. The time factor is much faster. So I think we have to become up to date and be able to obtain documents in both languages in emergency situations and in normal situations, so that we receive communications in a timely fashion. In other words, the same time. As you mentioned, it's a question of respect, but also a question of public safety. And I think we have to do that. We have no choice, and technology is there to make it possible. Thank you very much, Mr. Jolin.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Madame Lalonde. I have very little time to ask my question and receive an answer. So in a partial and objective ways, I'd like to turn to the youth and the next generation. And Mr. Doucette, you spoke. I'd like to speak to New Brunswickers. When I joined the Language Committee with Bernard Généreux, we heard the same thing. The pandemic has just emphasized the shortcomings and weaknesses. And all the examples that we've heard this evening are quite eloquent. But if there were one thing that we could change in the modernization to improve communications, and whether during a pandemic or during any emergency, a forest fire, flooding, whatever, is a central agency. If you had one choice to make for the modernization of the Act, would it be to have a central agency? And if so, why? If I had one choice to propose, it would be to recognize the uniqueness of New Brunswick in the federal legislation. We've submitted several applications in 2018 during our brief to the Senate. Without going into detail, there's the issue of the Part 4 size and immigration. There are all kinds of components. But the uniqueness of New Brunswick should be prioritized in any modernization of the Act. When you talk about New Brunswick's uniqueness or specificity, I hear this mentioned often. Could you explain the parallel between that?
Monsieur Arsenault, peut-être que vous devriez fermer votre...
Mr. Arsenault, perhaps you could turn your video off because we can no longer hear you. I would ask Mr. Cédric Doucet to try to answer. Well, I would answer by saying that Section 60 and 16.1 of the Charter and Part 7 of the Official Languages Act are of national scope, even if they're provisions that depend on laws that are national. They should give priority to national unity. Thank you very much. You really answered that on the fly. So thank you for the next 6 minutes. Over to Mr. Beaulieu. So please turn your microphone on. Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been very interesting. I was rather unpleasantly surprised to hear the British Columbia report. My question is for the New Brunswick Acadian National Group. You talk about the uniqueness, Mr. Doucette, of this group. You talk about the Official Languages Act, which is established on the basis of symmetry. In the 1988 version, I think what happened is that their special status in the Charter for New Brunswick, it was not reflected in the Official Languages Act. Do you think that it is possible to have this specific status of New Brunswick recognized? You're talking about the principle of where numbers justify. Is that a limitation for Acadians? Because you were able to obtain French language services in all of the municipalities, but you can't do it at the federal level. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you. If you don't mind, Mr. Beaulieu, I would let the Director General answer that. Go ahead. Please unmute yourself, Mr. Adishasson. Well, very clearly, you're talking about incongruity. You're talking about different types of scope. Well, it could be strange that a Canadian province, in this case New Brunswick, has official languages provisions which go beyond, well beyond, the obligations that the federal government has in the same territory. So if you're talking about something that's incongruous, that's what we mean. When we talk about delivering public services under Part 4 of the Act, where numbers justify, at the federal level, in New Brunswick, there isn't that limitation. So clearly, any modernization or amendment of the Act should enable citizens of New Brunswick to understand that their access to services in the official languages is equal in the same city, whether it's at the federal level or at the provincial level. That's just one example. Now, of course, if you go further, if you're talking about that notion of asymmetry, we don't want to be greedy or pretentious. We don't want to use the uniqueness of one province against the capacity of any other province, which may be less disposed to have access to the same kinds of services in terms of linguistic legislation. What we're talking about is amending this federal legislation, modernizing the federal law, should make it possible anywhere in Canada, but in particular because of the uniqueness of the provincial legislation for official languages, that all of Canada could accelerate the provision of services that are much more widespread. Where the census defines a region as being more likely to receive services, it should not be hindered by the same provisions. Thank you. Just another point. In your speech, Mr. Doucette, you said, you repeated a quote saying, I'm an Acadian. I'm a Canadian to the extent that enables me to be Acadian. Now, when we consider that Acadians have the lowest level of assimilation, but there still is assimilation that's increasing, do you consider that Acadians were wise to choose Canada and Confederation? That's an excellent question. I would say, I would answer as a politician. I think if the New Brunswick government is unable to represent and defend the French language for Acadians in New Brunswick, and if the federal government does not have the ability to put on its pants and defend the French language for minorities, for example, the Acadian nation of New Brunswick, I think we would have no choice but to look at other options. 30 seconds, Mr. Beaulieu. Well, maybe a question for the QCGN. The survey showing 38% of Quebec English speakers saying that they did not obtain sufficient services in English from the federal government. But the commissioner hasn't said that they've received many complaints from Quebec during the pandemic. How do you explain that? I apologize, Mr. Beaulieu, but that's all the time that we had. Perhaps you could come back to that during another round. Now I have to turn the floor over to Ms. Ashton for the next 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. I'd like to begin with questions for Ms. Jen Dunsing of BC. Your testimony was striking and impressive. I'd like to go into some detail about it. Could you explain what the typical profile is of new Francophone Canadians who come to Vancouver and BC? Can you tell me why access to French language services is so important to them? Well, I think French language services, well, any Francophone who arrives wants to be served in the language they're used to using and living in. To obtain services in French is a way for us to keep those Francophones in BC, because retention is very difficult right now. Because if we don't offer services to Francophones here, they're going to leave and go elsewhere. So to us, having those services for newcomers is very, very important. Another thing, not all Francophones come here bilingual. So having certain language services in French is very important so that we can keep them here. And we have to help them. We have to, integration, I'm an immigrant. And as an immigrant myself, I think that to be served in a language that I'm used to living in is very important. Thank you. Another question for you. You talked about access to services to counteract conjugal violence. Now, we know that conjugal violence and violence towards women has increased during the pandemic, and this is very worrisome. You said that there was some issue about what civil servants had said about French language services. There's a problem with a culture where the offer of service is not understood. We need initiatives so that civil servants have new skills, including learning French. What is missing so as to have civil servants who develop their skills and provide French language services? Well, once again, we're at the modernization of the Act. To have bilingual officials is a necessity now. Because if we don't have civil servants who are bilingual, we can't provide the services. As I said in my report, the issue of conjugal violence was one that increased, and women didn't know where to turn to be able to help them. I think that this has happened at a time where modernization is urgent. Absolutely, I very much appreciate the fact that you raised this issue, this very serious issue that women are experiencing. And in the case of your testimony, it's French-speaking women in BC who are experiencing this. Talking about the civil service and officials who should be bilingual and speak French, do you think that a financial incentive would help people understand the relevance of learning French and serving Francophones in BC? In other words, a bilingual premium, an improved bilingual premium. Would that help?
What I can say is that BC is the only province that does not have that policy for Francophone language services. It's important to us. Yes, it is, at the federal level. I myself used to work in the federal level, and when you were bilingual, you received a bonus. I'm not sure if that still exists, but I think that would help to receive some financial support in that sense. I'd like to thank you for your testimony and for your work. I do have a question for Mr. Doucette. First off, I want to thank you for your testimony, your passion on behalf of the Acadians that you represent. As a member of Parliament who used to be younger, let's be honest, the point that the Official Languages Act has not been modernized since before your own birth indicates how shocking the very fact is, and the urgency of addressing this issue of modernizing the Official Languages Act. You said it clearly. You would like to see the Official Languages Act modernized in short order. We fully support this request. You said that the act needed to be amended as soon as possible. Mr. Doucette, you also said that Acadians have been sidelined since the beginning. The white paper is a clear evidence of failure on the part of the government. I'd like to hear your views on the white paper versus the modernization of the act as it serving as a replacement. What do you think of that? If we look at the history of the modernization of the act, 1988, I think Brian Mulroney and Lucien Bouchard had done excellent work in the sense that they created a layman's version of it for the public, what the Official Languages Act was about. Brian Mulroney, with his counterparts in the provinces, really explained the changes that were afoot in the Official Languages Act. I think today the government did not have that discussion with its counterparts. If you want Part 7 to be more forceful, I'm sorry, Mr. Doucette. It is my job, unfortunately, to interrupt you because the time is up. Look, with our witnesses, we will do one last round. I see the time is flying. It's time flies when you're having fun, as they say. 5 minutes for the last turn, Mr. Blaney, Ms. Latanzio, and 2 minutes for Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 for Ms. Ashcroft. Mr. Blaney, you have the floor. 5 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to give Mr. Doucette the opportunity to finish what he had started. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Doucette. Yes, I was saying that in 88, there was an exercise engaged in to try to discuss, explain the Official Languages Act. And this time around, that wasn't done by the federal government. It could be that the white paper is exactly what the federal government will be doing. We're not necessarily against the white paper so long as there's a very quick implementation of a bill. That's what I wanted to say, because we want to improve Part 7 of the Act that will really give some teeth. With the federal spending power in order to have that in areas of jurisdiction, then the federal government needs certain things. Thank you. I'd like to get back to what Ms. Sanjun Singh was saying. You said that because there was a healthcare minister in BC who was bilingual, it had made things easier. You can't just have a country rest on the linguistic capacities of individuals. We really need to have mechanizations in place. That's going to be one of the aspects to take into consideration in the modernization. Mr. Jolin, I'd like to get back to what you were saying. It's a study on the pandemic, but you talked about the unfairness in terms of funding. You say there's a large number of Francophones in Ontario. You said that the underfunding is practically chronic on the part of the federal government, that causes difficulties and that they were worsened during the pandemic. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. even before the pandemic, there were some organizations that were having some difficulties. Some were having a hard time getting financing. 54% of francophones outside of Quebec, that's how much we represent. 23% of these OBNLs. And the pie is so small and spread out that the funding is not adequate to allow for these organizations to survive. 10% of our organizations are at risk. There are about 300 francophone organizations. It's 11%. And many organizations could disappear. Each time an organization disappears, it weakens the community that depends on that organization. Your message has well come across. I'd like to share my time with John Williamson. Mr. Williamson, you have the floor. You have 2 minutes, Mr. Williamson. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here with us today. Mr. Chasson, Mr. Doucette, you gave us a very good example here where the New Brunswick government did not do a good job. Overall, did it? Apparently, Quebec did a good job, which I'm surprised by. And the federal government, not so well. In New Brunswick, overall, during the pandemic, did Dr. Russell speak French? Were there interpretation services? Overall, what would be your impression? Well, exactly. The senior officials, you had Ms. Russell and the Chief Public Health Officer were bilingual, and they communicated in both official languages. But the Premier did not speak in both official languages, and he only had simultaneous interpretation. I'm a law student, so the issue is fundamentally interesting to me. One of the basic rulings, the BOLAC ruling, indicates that when you address the issue of official languages, we cannot talk about accommodations as such as interpretation, but equal treatment. So that's why we were saying having people who speak French or who are bilingual in place of Mr. Dix, because he was unable to effectively communicate in French and therefore uphold the Official Languages Act, and also out of respect for the Acadian community. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Your time is up. I'm sorry. Ms. Patricia Latanzo, you have 5 minutes. Ms. Latanzio, you have the floor. Unfortunately, the interpreter's having a really hard time hearing. Ms. Latanzio.
Issue. My questions are going to be addressed to the two ladies of QCGN, whom I've known as my function as a school board commissioner in my past life. So we've heard this week the testimony of RISA and CHSSN, clearly indicating to us that the community health networks and community groups have become a lifeline.
The interpretation, unfortunately, had to be interrupted. I'm sorry, Ms. Latanzio, we're having a problem with the interpretation. Your time has been stopped. Madam Clerk, can you check what is happening? Ms. Latanzio, are you on the right channel, on the English channel, I'm in the new system where it doesn't matter what channel you are on. It should happen automatically. The interpreter would point out that it is difficult to hear Ms. Latanzio in the booth for some reason. Ms. Latanzio, we're being told that your microphone is not connected. That is what the technician is saying, not the interpreter. According to me, Ms. Latanzio says that it is connected. Should I take the headphones off and try again? The interpreter says that they can't hear you well. Can you just suspend for one moment, Mr. Dufour? Okay, Madam Clerk. Just a few seconds. Thank you. Thank you. I would ask Ms. Latanzio to mute. Thank you. So let's resume. I would invite Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Beaulieu, you have 2.5 minutes to speak the question. To speak, Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. First off, Mr. Doucette, in your speech, you say that in the last 50 years, you've gotten to this point, and we're still asking for the same thing. The question is kind of also for the other participants. During this whole time, the level of assimilation of francophones has increased exponentially. Do you think we'll be able to change things under this modernization? Do you think we can turn things around? Answer. I think the question was for me. I'll answer. It's like anything else. The modernization of the Official Languages Act has to be done in 2 phases. First of all, you've got the bill, modernization itself, and then one of the most crucial issues is the implementation. There has to be political will to really implement the provisions, because you may have the best legislative provisions in the world, but if there's no political will to implement them, it's useless, it's pointless. That is the issue, the political will that will really prevail. For QCGN, I'm not sure, during the last session, your predecessor, Ms. Jennings, as to the school measures in place, had said that there were good reasons to restrict access to English schools in the 60s, but it's less and less relevant today. That the French language is doing well in Quebec, that it should be done away with because it's a violation of civil rights. Do you share that view, and do you agree to say that there has been a decline in French in Quebec today? You have 40 seconds, Ms. Jennings. The QCGM and I myself, we believe
needs to be protected. And we have always believed that. But we also believe that the English-speaking communities of Quebec, we're Quebecers, and we also have rights, and our vitality is in danger, not because we cannot speak English, but because our educational institutions, population's going down.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jennings. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Now, Ms. Ashton, you have 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Jolin and Ms. Jennings from QCGN. I have a question about local media in the official language of minority communities. Ms. Lauzon from the Association de la Presse Francophone cried out to the federal government, saying that they abandoned the local media during the pandemic. The purchase of publicity or advertising among these media did not compensate for the lack of commercial revenue. I would like to know if that is something that these local media in the communities you represent have felt. What kind of financial difficulties did they face? Mr. Jolin, Ms. Jennings, if I can start. Local media were already in a really challenging, difficult position because both levels of government directed their money towards social media. That revenue has been tilted that way, which means that Francophone media throughout the country have felt really some pressure, have had to cut positions and the size of the documents they were producing. As to the pandemic, clearly, the federal government's publicity, advertising, was more focused on the Anglophone side. We took some measures and we got involved. And then there were some advertising contracts given to our Francophone media, which was really important to meet our people. And also, it allowed these media sources to survive during the pandemic. But the problem remains. There's an underfunding that is serious, severe among the Francophone media, and they are really facing challenges.
English-speaking Quebecers, the fact that the provincial government did not publish its 24-page guide in English and deliver it at the same time or almost immediately after the delivery in French meant that over 1 million Quebecers didn't have access to this urgent information for health and safety in their language, their mother tongue, until more than 2 months later. But I commend the government, because when we did reach out to Mr. Legault's government and point that out, we worked together to see that it would be translated and it would be delivered to the homes. That's one. Two, our community newspapers were essential, and we need to continue. The federal government and provincial governments need to include them in the messaging and provide support for their ongoing vitality.
Merci, Madame Jennings.
Thank you, Madam Jennings. I apologize. And finally, we will try again with Ms. Latanzio.
4 minutes et demie.
Ms. Latanzio, you have 4.5 minutes for your intervention. Okay, now I'm going to put these things on.
Past Tuesday from RISA and CHSSN indicated to us that the community health networks and community groups have become a lifeline for the English-speaking populations in terms of finding and getting the information that they needed during the pandemic, playing, as the term calls it, the middleman between the governments and communities. So can you both ladies speak to the QCGN's outreach and operation in the context of the pandemic? And two, how have you had to adapt to English sectors during this difficult time?
Excusez, il semble avoir encore des problèmes d'interprétation.
Sorry, but there seem to be interpretation difficulties again. The question is for the QCGN. So please go ahead, and I'll see Mr. Beaulieu whether the translation can work. Go ahead.
Our Director General to answer that question. So put your mic on, Sylvia.
Yes. So both federal and provincial coordination, as we said earlier, is important in this in such situations of pandemics, health and social health crises. For the funding that is available to us from the Health Canada is important in terms of promotion, is important for our networks. Increasingly, we find ourselves having to supplement the work that the province should be doing for our English-speaking Quebecers. So, for example, when the guide didn't come out, many of the groups had it translated or used money to translate the guide and distributed it. That's a very good initiative, but it's not what we should expect from our government.
What other? Oh, sorry.
Oui, allez-y.
Go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. The sound is unintelligible to allow for proper interpretation, unfortunately.
Problème de communication. Et je vais vous inviter peut-être à compléter vos réponses pour manque de temps, si vous le voulez, par via de mémoire ou par écrit ou tout autre sujet auquel on n'a pas pu aborder avec vous aujourd'hui parce que ces problèmes techniques nous ont empêchés justement de faire le suivi. Merci.
Par respect, M. Beaulieu, je vais répondre en...
Out of respect for Mr. Beaulieu, I'm going to answer in French. We received the guide roughly 2 months after it was published in French. Well, it was good to receive it, but there is no standard. No standard has been established. We're not sure that if this were to happen a second time or for any other documents, if any other documents have to be given to English-speaking Quebecers, whether or not it will be done. And this is in spite of the fact that the legislation on health services stipulates that there are times when translation must be done and that the documents must be available in several languages, in English as well. It's not just English, it's in several languages. If there's a crisis, it's important. People die, so standards have to be there, but we don't have that guarantee. You can't expect organizations to do the work for the government. That's not acceptable. A reasonable and generous government must provide these services in times of crisis, definitely, and they must be provided to the English-speaking community. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is all the question time that we have. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for participating. I'd also like to thank you for your collaboration because we did go beyond 5:30. So very big thank you to Mr. Carole Jolin, President, Mr. Omniak, Director General, Executive General, Fédération des Francophones de la Colombie-Britannique, Mrs. Padmini Chandan-Singh, who is Chair of the Board, and the QCGN, Marlene Jennings, President, and Sylvia Martin-Laforge, Executive Director or General Director, and the Société de l'Acadie du Nouveau-Brunswick, with your President, Alexandre Cédric Doucet, and Ali Chesson. So thank you again to all of you, and please don't hesitate to send us any other information you deem useful. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the entire technical team, the analysts, the clerk, and everybody for this wonderful session. So on this note, thank you very much. Safe home and have a nice evening. And thank you again for participating. Good evening. Bye-bye. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays. Thank you.